The first time my father chose her words over mine, I was sitting at the kitchen table counting the cracks in the wall, unaware that I was already being quietly replaced. I did not feel betrayed then, only slightly unsteady, like someone had shifted the ground beneath the house while leaving the furniture untouched. I was 23 that year, old enough to believe that families were finished shaping you, that whatever damage or love they carried had already done its work, and young enough to think permanence was a given, that the people who had loved you once would continue doing so simply because they always had. Our home had not changed much since my mother died, not in the visible ways at least, and when my father remarried, I told myself that stability was a kind of grace, that grief did not have to dismantle everything it touched. My stepmother arrived without spectacle, without the theatrical kindness people warn you about, without the sharp edges that make stories easier to tell later, and I liked her immediately because there was nothing to defend myself against. She spoke gently, listened more than she talked, cooked meals that tasted familiar without trying to replicate my mother's, and never once suggested she was there to replace anyone. She called me by my name, never by a diminutive or a forced term of affection, and she gave me space in a way that felt respectful rather than distant. If there were moments that felt off, I dismissed them as my own insecurity, the leftover static of grief, the discomfort of learning new rhythms. She reorganized the house slowly, room by room, not changing things so much as refining them, placing objects where they made more sense, smoothing edges that had been jagged for years. My father seemed lighter, less withdrawn, and I told myself that this was all anyone could hope for after loss, a life that continued without demanding applause. We ate dinner together most nights, the three of us sitting around the same table I had done homework at as a child, my father asking about my work, my stepmother remembering details I had forgotten I mentioned, the conversation flowing easily enough that silence never lingered. She never interrupted me, never corrected me in front of him, never did anything that would later feel incriminating. When people talk about wickedness, they expect sharp teeth, but what I lived with was smooth and unremarkable and entirely plausible. At the time, I believed love was something that could expand without competition, that adding one person did not require subtracting another, and so when decisions began happening without my input, I told myself it was coincidence, that adulthood simply meant fewer family meetings and more individual autonomy. My father and stepmother discussed finances behind closed doors, future plans over quiet morning coffee, and I did not resent it because I assumed there would be a place for me when it mattered. I was wrong about when things matter. The first time I needed help, I did not ask for much, only a bridge between where I was and where I was trying to get, a temporary steadiness while I found my footing. My work situation had collapsed in a way that felt both sudden and humiliating, the kind of professional failure that erodes your confidence before it touches your bank account, and I went home one evening rehearsing the conversation in my head, not because I expected resistance but because I did not want to sound irresponsible. My father listened quietly as I explained, his hands folded on the table, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned, and when I finished, he did not respond immediately. He looked toward my stepmother, not in a dramatic way, not as if seeking permission, but as if continuing a conversation I had not been part of, and she nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, before meeting my eyes with a soft smile that suggested understanding. They framed the refusal carefully, with language that sounded like wisdom rather than abandonment, explaining that struggle was formative, that assistance could become a crutch, that independence was something earned through discomfort. My stepmother spoke about resilience, about learning from consequences, about the long-term harm of short-term solutions, and my father echoed her points with the confidence of someone relieved to have them articulated. I left that night feeling embarrassed more than hurt, convinced I had misjudged the situation, that I had expected too much, that this was simply what adulthood looked like when you removed sentimentality. I did not accuse them of anything because there was nothing obvious to accuse, no raised voices, no dismissive gestures, no cruelty I could point to without sounding ungrateful. Life did not collapse all at once, which made it easier for them to overlook it, a slow unraveling that happened mostly out of sight. I downsized my expectations, my living situation, my sense of self, telling myself this was temporary, that rebuilding was part of the process, that pride was a luxury I could not afford. I did not stop loving my father, did not question his intentions, and I certainly did not see my stepmother as an antagonist because nothing she did violated the rules of decency. When I visited home, she asked about my plans with genuine interest, offered advice that sounded practical, suggested resources that were just out of reach, and spoke about me to extended family as if I were doing exactly what I intended to do, crafting a narrative of quiet competence that contradicted the reality I was living. It was not unkind, but it was not true either, and I lacked the clarity to understand why that distinction mattered. My father grew more distant without becoming cold, less involved without appearing indifferent, and I attributed it to his work, his marriage, the natural loosening of parental oversight. I did not see how thoroughly my presence in his life had been compartmentalized, how my struggles had been reframed into something abstract, a concept rather than a lived experience, manageable precisely because it was no longer immediate. There were moments when I almost said something, when I nearly pushed back, when I considered naming the discomfort I felt, but each time I imagined the conversation, it dissolved under scrutiny because there was no clear injustice to address. How do you accuse someone of loving you responsibly, of believing you capable, of refusing to interfere in your growth? And yet, something in me began to change, not into anger, not yet, but into a sharper awareness of how easily narratives can be shaped when one person controls the framing. I noticed how my stepmother remembered conversations differently, how she summarized my choices with a confidence that left no room for correction, how she spoke on my behalf even when I was present, not over me, but around me, constructing a version of me that required no intervention. I did not know then that this was the beginning of my erasure, not a dramatic removal but a gradual fading, a reduction of relevance achieved through calm consistency. I still believed that if things became dire enough, if I truly needed them, the instinct to protect would override philosophy, that blood and history carried a weight no argument could neutralize. Part 1 ends with me still believing that love, once given, cannot be withdrawn without notice, still trusting the surface of things, still unaware that the foundation of my place in that family had already been quietly restructured without me present to object, and that the person I would eventually become was being forged not by malice, but by a refusal so reasonable it took years to recognize its cost. The strange thing about being abandoned politely is that it takes time to realize you are alone, because nothing ever announces itself as an ending and no door is ever slammed hard enough to echo. Life simply continues in a narrower corridor, with fewer places to rest, and by the time you understand what has been removed, you have already learned how to walk without it. After that first refusal, I told myself I would recover quickly, that setbacks were temporary, that my father's restraint was proof of his faith in me, and for a while I carried that belief like a shield, repeating it whenever the days became heavier than expected. I worked harder, accepted compromises I would once have rejected, and learned how to compress my needs into something manageable, something that did not inconvenience anyone else. I did not go home as often. It was not a decision so much as a quiet drift, the result of schedules that never aligned and conversations that ended before they began. When I did visit, the house felt smaller, not physically but emotionally, as if my presence occupied a space that had already been repurposed. My stepmother had settled fully into her role, not as an intruder but as the axis around which everything now turned, managing logistics, social obligations, and emotional tone with equal ease. She asked me about my life with interest that felt sincere, but there was always an undertone of assessment, as if she were cataloguing my answers rather than absorbing them. She remembered what I told her, but only the parts that fit the version of me she seemed comfortable maintaining, and when she repeated my story later, it emerged streamlined, optimistic, devoid of urgency. I sounded capable in her telling, composed, someone who did not require attention. My father listened when I spoke, but his attention felt divided, his responses measured and oddly distant, as though he were already considering how my words would be interpreted later in a different conversation. He did not ask follow-up questions the way he used to, did not probe for details or offer unsolicited advice, and I noticed that when he did speak, his language echoed my stepmother's phrasing, careful and generalized, avoiding anything that might imply responsibility. At first, I blamed myself for feeling unsettled. I told myself that this was simply what adulthood did to families, that intimacy gave way to formality, that independence came with a necessary thinning of emotional ties. But the more I struggled, the more obvious it became that I was struggling alone, and the absence of concern began to feel deliberate rather than incidental. There came a moment when I could no longer maintain the illusion of self-sufficiency, when the gap between what I could manage and what I needed became too wide to ignore, and I reached out again, not dramatically, not with desperation, but with honesty stripped of embellishment. I explained where I was, what I had tried, what had failed, and what kind of support might make a difference, framing it carefully so it did not sound like entitlement. The response was swift and composed. My stepmother spoke first, outlining the importance of consistency, of personal accountability, of not rescuing people from the consequences of their decisions, even when those people were loved. She spoke about boundaries, about preserving family harmony, about the danger of setting precedents that could not be sustained. Her tone was gentle, almost apologetic, and she met my eyes as if inviting me to agree with her. My father nodded along, adding small affirmations, reinforcing the logic without expanding on it, and when he finally addressed me directly, his voice carried a calm finality that left no space for negotiation. He told me he believed I would figure it out, that this phase would pass, that intervening now would do more harm than good. I realized then that the decision had been made long before I entered the room. What unsettled me most was not the refusal itself, but the absence of discomfort it seemed to cause them, the way they settled back into their evening afterward, conversation shifting easily to unrelated topics, the moment already categorized and resolved. There was no lingering tension, no sense of having denied something significant, and I understood, with a clarity that startled me, that my hardship did not register as an emergency within the structure of their lives. From that point on, the distance between us stopped feeling accidental. I stopped offering updates unless asked, and they stopped asking unless prompted by obligation. Family gatherings became polite exchanges of surface-level information, my stepmother filling silences with anecdotes that emphasized stability and forward motion, my father smiling in agreement, content with the version of events she curated. I was not excluded, but I was no longer essential, and the difference weighed on me in ways I did not yet have language for. Outside the family, my life grew harsher before it grew stronger. I learned how quickly circumstances can strip away assumptions, how fragile confidence becomes when it is no longer reinforced, and how easy it is for people to disappear when you cannot offer them ease. I adapted out of necessity, developing a resilience that was less about strength and more about endurance, a steady refusal to collapse completely. There were nights when I considered confronting them, when I imagined laying out the reality of my situation in a way that could not be reframed or softened, but each time I rehearsed the conversation, I heard my stepmother's voice in my head, calm and reasonable, already translating my words into something manageable, something that did not require action. I began to understand that the issue was not whether they cared, but how they defined caring, and how narrow that definition had become. What I did not realize then was how thoroughly my stepmother had positioned herself as the interpreter of my life, the one who contextualized my choices, my struggles, and my needs for my father, filtering them through a lens that emphasized autonomy over connection. She did not lie outright. She simply selected which truths were relevant, which details mattered, and which could be safely omitted. And my father trusted her. He trusted her judgment because it offered him peace, because it allowed him to believe that he was being supportive without being involved, that he was loving without being burdened. He accepted the version of me she presented because it aligned with his desire for stability, and I became complicit in that version by failing to challenge it. By the time I noticed that weeks could pass without meaningful contact, that decisions about family matters were communicated to me after the fact, that my presence was optional rather than expected, the shift had already solidified. I was no longer at the center of my father's concern, not because he had stopped loving me, but because someone else had convinced him that love did not require proximity or sacrifice. The realization did not arrive with anger, but with a dull, persistent ache, the kind that settles into your body and changes how you move through the world. I understood then that whatever I rebuilt would have to be built without the expectation of familial rescue, that waiting for recognition or remorse would only prolong the damage. Part 2 closes with me standing fully inside my own life, unsupported but still intact, beginning to see the architecture of the distance that had been constructed around me, not yet plotting revenge, not yet imagining power, but quietly acknowledging that something fundamental had been taken from me, and that nothing short of transformation would ever return it. There is a particular freedom that comes from realizing no one is coming to save you, not the kind that feels triumphant, but the kind that settles into your bones and forces you to decide who you are without an audience. Once that understanding took hold, I stopped measuring my progress against what I had lost and began shaping my life around what I could still build, not out of optimism, but out of necessity. I moved without ceremony, choosing places that offered anonymity rather than comfort, environments where my history carried no weight and my failures were invisible. I learned quickly which skills mattered and which were indulgences, how to listen more than I spoke, and how to read rooms with the same precision my stepmother had always displayed, though my motivation was survival rather than control. I paid attention to people who did not promise transformation but offered consistency, and I accepted help where it was given without attaching expectations to it. The work itself was unglamorous at first, repetitive, and demanding in ways that left little space for reflection, but it taught me discipline and attention, a respect for process that I had never fully developed when I believed there was always a safety net beneath me. I failed often, though each failure was quieter than the last, absorbed quickly and studied rather than dramatized. Over time, those lessons compounded into competence, and competence began to open doors that had once seemed theoretical. I did not announce these changes to my family. There was no point, and I had learned the cost of narrating my life to people who would reinterpret it to suit their comfort. When my father asked, occasionally, how things were going, I answered honestly but briefly, offering no texture for translation. My stepmother responded with encouragement that sounded automatic, her interest polite rather than probing, and I sensed that whatever she imagined about my life remained fixed, unchallenged by my restraint. What changed, slowly and then all at once, was the scale of my world. Opportunities emerged that required trust, responsibility, and judgment, and I found that I could meet them without hesitation. People began to rely on me, not emotionally but professionally, and that reliance brought a clarity I had never experienced within my family, where expectations were always softened by history. Here, competence mattered more than narrative, and I thrived in the absence of sentiment. Financial stability arrived incrementally, then decisively, not through a single windfall but through accumulation, the kind that reshapes your relationship with time. I no longer had to choose between rest and progress, between dignity and necessity, and with that freedom came a sharpened awareness of how power functions quietly, through access, timing, and credibility rather than force. I observed this not with resentment, but with interest, cataloguing the mechanisms I had once been excluded from. My family remained distant, though not estranged. We exchanged messages on birthdays, shared updates during holidays, maintained the appearance of continuity without substance. I was invited to events as an obligation rather than a desire, and I attended selectively, noting how my absence registered less than it once would have. My stepmother continued to manage these interactions, scheduling, reminding, smoothing over gaps with practiced ease, and I recognized in her a talent I had come to respect even as I resented its impact. It was through extended family that fragments of my progress began to circulate, distorted by omission but undeniable in effect. Someone mentioned my work in passing, another commented on a lifestyle shift they had observed from a distance, and these details reached my father filtered through voices my stepmother did not fully control. I noticed the first shift during a phone call when he asked a question that indicated surprise rather than reassurance, his curiosity no longer entirely mediated. I did not correct him. I let the ambiguity stand. As my influence expanded, so did my understanding of what had happened to me, not as a personal failing or an isolated family dynamic, but as a case study in how authority and affection intersect. My stepmother had not needed to undermine me directly because she had never competed with me for love. She had competed for relevance, and she had won by making herself indispensable. My father, seeking stability after loss, had deferred to the person who offered coherence, and in doing so, he had outsourced discernment. This realization did not harden me, but it did sharpen me. I stopped hoping for acknowledgement and began focusing on alignment, on ensuring that my choices reflected my values rather than my wounds. I built relationships that were reciprocal, partnerships that were transparent, and a life that did not require permission. In the process, I became someone my past self would not have recognized, not because I had transformed completely, but because I had consolidated what mattered. Years passed in this way, quietly and productively, until the balance shifted again, this time in the opposite direction. I sensed it first through tone rather than content, a subtle warmth in messages that had once been perfunctory, an interest that felt newly intentional. My stepmother reached out more frequently, asking questions that hinted at curiosity rather than politeness, and my father's voice carried a tentative quality I had not heard in years. I understood then that something had changed for them, though I did not yet know what form that change had taken. I did not rush to respond or inquire, choosing instead to observe, to let the situation reveal itself without intervention. Patience had become one of my most valuable skills, and I trusted it more than impulse. What they did not know was that by the time they began to look toward me again, I had already completed the most difficult part of my journey, the part where survival becomes choice, where independence becomes identity. I was no longer building in reaction to their absence, but in affirmation of my own capacity, and whatever came next would be met from a position of clarity rather than need. Part 3 ends with me standing fully inside a life they had not witnessed, aware that my family's renewed attention was not an accident but a response to forces they could no longer manage alone, and understanding, with a calm certainty, that the power dynamic between us had shifted irrevocably, not through confrontation or spectacle, but through time, distance, and deliberate self-construction. When I finally agreed to see them again, it was not out of longing or forgiveness, but curiosity sharpened by distance, the kind that comes from knowing you are no longer vulnerable to the outcome. I did not prepare myself emotionally because there was nothing left to brace for, no approval to win, no rejection to survive, only an interest in seeing what remained when the old roles could no longer be sustained. The house looked the same from the outside, familiar enough to trigger memory without stirring attachment, and as I stepped inside, I noticed how carefully everything had been maintained, how the appearance of continuity had been preserved even as something less visible had shifted. My stepmother greeted me first, her smile warm and practiced, her embrace brief and appropriate, as if she were calibrating the correct degree of intimacy for someone she could not yet categorize. My father followed, quieter than I remembered, his affection restrained by uncertainty, and in that hesitation I recognized the absence of authority I had once taken for granted. He no longer spoke from certainty, but from inquiry, as though he were assessing where he stood with me rather than assuming the ground beneath him. The realization did not satisfy me, but it did confirm what I had already suspected. We sat together in the living room, conversation unfolding politely, each of us circling familiar topics without committing to them, and I listened more than I spoke, attentive to what was said and what was avoided. My stepmother asked about my work with an interest that felt newly focused, her questions specific enough to signal research rather than speculation, and I answered without elaboration, offering clarity without narrative. She nodded thoughtfully, absorbing details she could not immediately contextualize, and I sensed her recalibrating, adjusting the version of me she had maintained for years. My father watched this exchange closely, his attention shifting between us, as if he were witnessing a dynamic he had not fully understood before, and I wondered how much of my absence had been filled with assumption rather than fact. The purpose of the visit emerged gradually, introduced not as a request but as a shared concern, a situation that had developed over time and now required careful handling. Financial strain was mentioned obliquely, followed by references to changing circumstances, to obligations that could no longer be managed as easily as before. My stepmother framed it as a collective challenge, something families navigate together, her language inclusive without being explicit. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough to shift the balance of the room, to move the weight of expectation back onto them. When I spoke, it was to ask questions, precise and neutral, about timelines, decisions, and accountability, not because I needed the information, but because I wanted to see how they handled scrutiny. My stepmother answered smoothly, outlining strategies already attempted, emphasizing prudence and foresight, and when gaps appeared, my father filled them with generalities that revealed more uncertainty than confidence. It became clear that they had anticipated cooperation rather than evaluation, that my role in their minds was supportive rather than authoritative, and I watched as that assumption faltered. Over the next weeks, contact increased. Messages arrived framed as updates rather than appeals, invitations extended under the guise of reconnect ion, and I accepted selectively, maintaining control over access without announcing it. Each interaction revealed more, not of crisis, but of dependency, a reliance on stability they no longer possessed and had not prepared to rebuild. I began to set boundaries quietly, not by refusing outright, but by clarifying terms, requesting transparency, and declining to act without full context. These were not confrontational moves, but they disrupted the ease with which my stepmother had once directed outcomes, and I saw the strain in the way she adjusted, her composure intact but her certainty diminished. My father, caught between familiarity and reality, began to ask questions of his own, tentative at first, then more pointed, and I recognized in him a dawning awareness of how much had been managed on his behalf. He did not accuse her, and I did not encourage him to, but the shift was undeniable, a recalibration of trust driven not by conflict but by exposure to alternatives. There was no moment of revelation, no dramatic unmasking, only a steady erosion of assumptions as my presence altered the dynamic. I did not revisit the past or articulate grievances because there was no need to, and because doing so would have offered them a narrative they could contest or soften. Instead, I focused on the present, on what was being asked of me now and what I was willing to provide. When the request finally arrived, it was framed carefully, positioned as a temporary measure, a bridge until circumstances improved. My stepmother spoke with practiced sincerity, acknowledging my success, expressing pride, emphasizing family unity, and for the first time, she addressed me directly rather than through implication, her voice carrying a subtle urgency she could not entirely mask. I listened without interruption, noting how much effort it took for her to cede control of the conversation, and when she finished, I thanked her for her honesty. I told them I needed time to consider, not as a delay tactic, but because I wanted the decision to be deliberate, unclouded by emotion or expectation. As I left that evening, my father walked me to the door, his expression unreadable, and for a brief moment, I saw regret flicker across his face, not for the present situation, but for something older and harder to name. He did not speak it, and I did not invite him to, because some realizations must arrive without assistance to have weight. Part 4 closes with the balance fully shifted, my family aware that they no longer controlled the terms of our relationship, and me preparing to make a choice that would define not only how I engaged with them moving forward, but how completely I had outgrown the need to be validated by their recognition. I did not agonize over the decision as much as they probably expected me to, because by the time the choice arrived, it had already been made years earlier in quieter moments when no one was watching and no one cared how I landed. What remained was not deliberation but articulation, the careful shaping of a truth that would not invite debate or reinterpretation. When I returned to the house for the last time, the atmosphere was different, stripped of pretense, the air heavier with anticipation than familiarity. My stepmother had prepared meticulously, not in appearance but in demeanor, her composure sharpened into something almost formal, as if she was stepping into a negotiation rather than a conversation. My father sat beside her, hands folded, posture attentive, his presence earnest in a way that felt newly intentional, and I understood that whatever happened next would settle something that had been unresolved for far too long. I began by acknowledging what they had asked of me, not dismissively and not defensively, but plainly, outlining the scope of their need in terms that left no room for ambiguity. I spoke about numbers, timelines, and implications, about what assistance would require from me not just financially but structurally, and I watched as my stepmother nodded along, relieved by the familiarity of logistics, reassured by the illusion that this was proceeding as she had anticipated. Then I told them no. I did not soften it with apologies or explanations meant to comfort, because comfort had never been extended to me when I needed it most. I explained that I would not provide financial support, not now and not in the future, and that my decision was not driven by resentment or punishment, but by alignment, by a commitment to the life I had built and the principles that sustained it. I told them that I had learned, through experience rather than theory, that assistance given without reciprocity corrodes both sides, and that I would not recreate that dynamic under the guise of family obligation. My stepmother responded first, as she always had, her voice steady but edged with disbelief, reframing my refusal as misunderstanding, reminding me of shared history, of the sacrifices she and my father had made, of the importance of unity in difficult times. She spoke carefully, avoiding accusation, positioning my success as something that naturally flowed back toward its source, and for a moment, I recognized the elegance of her argument, the way it would have persuaded me once. I let her finish before speaking again. I told her that when I had been at my lowest, when assistance would not have endangered anyone's stability or autonomy, I had been refused with the same calm conviction she now used to request help. I told her that I had accepted that refusal as instruction, that I had learned exactly how much support this family believed was appropriate, and that I had modeled my decision accordingly. I did not accuse her of malice or manipulation, because that would have allowed her to defend herself, and instead I named the outcome, the reality of being left to manage alone, and the competence that solitude had forced me to develop. My father listened in silence, his attention fixed on me, and when I finished, he did not look at her, but at the space between us, as though tracing the distance he had allowed to grow unchecked. He spoke quietly, not to contradict me, but to acknowledge what he had not wanted to see, that he had trusted the structure of his life more than the relationships within it, that he had mistaken calm for correctness, and that his absence during my struggle had been a choice, even if it had not felt like one at the time. There was no dramatic apology, no plea for forgiveness, only recognition, and it was enough to close something that had been open for too long. I told him that I did not need reparations or reassurance, that I had already built what I needed without them, and that my refusal did not negate the possibility of a relationship, but it did redefine its limits. What I offered instead was clarity. I told them I was willing to maintain contact, to share time, to engage honestly without pretense or rewriting, but that I would not become a solution to problems I had been excluded from preventing. I would not fund decisions I had not been consulted on, nor would I assume responsibility for outcomes shaped without my involvement. I would meet them as adults, equal in agency and consequence, or not at all. My stepmother did not argue further. Her silence was not defeat, but recalibration, the recognition that control was no longer available to her in this context, that the leverage she had relied on had dissolved. My father nodded once, slowly, as though committing the moment to memory, and I knew then that whatever relationship remained would be different, not repaired, but honest in a way it had never been before. When I left, there was no lingering at the door, no unspoken hope that I might reconsider, only a mutual understanding that something definitive had occurred. I walked away without triumph or bitterness, carrying neither victory nor loss, but resolution, the rare and steady kind that does not require validation. In the months that followed, contact settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, measured and transparent, free of expectation. They managed their circumstances without my intervention, adjusting to a reality that no longer included my resources, and I continued my life uninterrupted, unburdened by guilt or second-guessing. The revenge, if it could be called that, was not in what I took from them, but in what I refused to give, the quiet assertion that access to me was no longer unconditional. The story ends not with estrangement or reconciliation, but with balance restored, each of us living with the consequences of our choices, and me finally certain that the life I had built was not only mine to enjoy, but mine to protect, complete and intact, without apology or regret.